Welcome to Faith, Politics, and the Law. This is part of our Practical Politics and the Law series, and it's sponsored by the Duke Journal of Constitutional Law and the program in Public Law. And I would be remiss not to thank at the outset Dana Norville, who has done an enormous amount of work for today's event, and we are very grateful for her help. And we're thrilled that Jim Towey is here to share his experience with us today. Mr. Towey is currently the president of Saint Vincent College in Pennsylvania, but his career in public service has spanned nearly 20 years. Earlier in his career, President Towey served as the secretary of Florida's Health and Social Services Agency, and after leaving state government, he founded a nonprofit organization, Aging with Dignity, that helps families plan for end-of-life care. President Towey has also served as the assistant to the president for the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. Most notably, President Towey was legal counsel for Mother Teresa for 12 years, living for a time in one of Mother Teresa's missions in Mexico, and later working in a Washington, D.C. home for those with AIDS. Mr. Towey, a graduate of Florida State University College of Law, brings a wealth of experience to us today, and we look forward to hearing his perspective on faith, politics, and the law.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for that very nice introduction that I wrote. I'm kidding. I want to thank Professor Schrader also for the kind invitation to be with you. My wife and I have 5 children. We have 4 boys that are 14, 12, 10, and 7. We have a little girl that's 4. So I'm used to at meal times people eating and not listening. So this is a treat to have actually people maybe listening a little. But feel free to get up if you need to at any point, get other food or to be at this great university. It's hard for me to suppress a laugh. As a law student, I was not a very good law student. I took any class that didn't require attendance, and my grades kind of made Dan Quayle look like a legal scholar. So to be here lecturing at the law school for me is it's a very great honor, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I know I would not be here if it weren't for my friendship and long-standing association with a modern-day saint, President Bush. So, no, I'm kidding, just kidding. See if you're listening. You're like, he drank the Kool-Aid. Oh, no. President Bush always joked about how it's true, I did work for Mother Teresa for 12 years. And I did her legal work I still do work for the Missionaries of Charity, the order that she started. President Bush always liked to joke and say, what kind of world do we live in when even Mother Teresa had to have an attorney? And but not many people know this, but she liked to sue people. No, I'm kidding. She did. You open that soup kitchen, I'll ruin you. I'm brand new to the institutions of higher education. As Sarah mentioned in my invitation, I get to know Sarah and Katie at the White House. But I'm new to higher education because I started as president of Saint Vincent College. Very proud to be part of academia now. I come as a complete outsider to it. And so I've been there for 8 months. And President Bush, when I first told him of this opportunity and that I'd accepted the position, he joked and said, "Oh, you just wanted to be called Mr. President." And Carl said, will they play Hail to the Chief when you walk in the room? And I said, no, they'll play How Great Thou Art. So Mary and I have adjusted. It's a little different from the White House. And I remember the first time I started working there, and I'm going to segue into material, but I remember just showing up there. It was kind of a miracle because, first of all, I'm not a Republican. I'm a Democrat, a pro-life Democrat. There's about 10 in the country. And the opportunity to try to go there and in some way help the poor. And I had not worked for President Bush in the campaign. I didn't know any of the people, but a year into the administration, I was chosen as the second faith-based director. The first gentleman, John DiIulio, a great man from academia from the University of Pennsylvania who had a real heart and has a heart for the poor, had been my predecessor also a Democrat. And so I started working there, and I felt like I kind of landed on Mars when I started there at the White House, and parking there on the side of the West Wing in the morning and walking in there is Secretary of State Colin Powell, great American, and see Condi Rice, and it's kind of strange, And I remember coming in there and said, "Where do I park?" And they say, "Don't park in, you can park anywhere you want on the side, but not those 2 spaces near the door, because that's where the Vice President's limousines are parked." I'm like, "I'm not going to park in his parking spaces. They won't just tow my car, they'll blow it up." So, but you'd go in there and you're around these really powerful people. To see them, I can remember several times, 3 or 4 times, where I'd just literally be walking up the staircase of the West Wing, and down comes this Secret Service agent walking ahead of the president who's coming down the stairs to go to the situation room. But I have to say that in my life, the most powerful people that I've known are the poor, and the disabled, and the elderly, and the addicted, and the refugees. They're very powerful people because they have in their person, they are witness to something very powerful and important about the dignity of every man, woman, and child. And they also have the power in our encounter with them to transform our lives and to unleash in us things we didn't know existed in us. The ability to express mercy, to express love, to grow, to go outside of our comfort zone, and to encounter individuals who may appear to be poor, but in fact often are our benefactors, that they can enrich our lives because they help reveal to us truths about ourselves and others, and about life, and about existence, and the purpose of life. I've had that experience of course, I think I owe this to Mother Teresa, because I met her in 1985 in Calcutta, and I saw her compassion in action. And if I speak on a subject like faith and politics and public life, political work, I will speak as a Christian today because I am Christian. But I do so with a respect for the other great religions of our world, and also a great respect for people of no faith at all. Working in the White House, I met nearly every single religious leader in the country at different times during the 4.5 years I was there. Very impressive to see these holy men and women and the sincerity of their faith and their shared pursuit of the truth. Gandhi, one of my great heroes, born in 1869, his autobiography, it's worth reading if you find time, called My Experiments with the Truth, that chronicles his own journey, his own faith journey, and is also as a lawyer, his own encounters with injustice and what exactly was justice. Fascinating prophet for you to study as you matriculate here in this law school. But as a Christian, encountering what Mother Teresa spoke of as Jesus in his disguise of the poor, there in Calcutta in that home. And to learn a lot, I think, about the great dignity of men, women, and children, because ultimately, faith and politics converge in that question that has really echoed through times. Who's my neighbor? Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? These are questions that have really echoed through time to this day, that we're still confronted with. That homeless man that we encounter on the street, that child in Durham that's studying, that comes from a broken family, that addict that's enslaved in drugs. These are questions. Am I their keeper? What is my relationship with them? These are questions where faith and politics converge. And I think it often triggers an individual response, your own personal response. Do I stop and talk to the individual? Do I go and mentor? Do I go and visit the elderly in the nursing home? Mother Teresa was asked one time what the worst disease was she'd ever seen. Was it leprosy or was it AIDS? And she said no, it was loneliness. And we see this terrible disease in our country many times among our wealthy, who feel unloved and unwanted and unwelcome, who don't feel loved for who they are but for what they have or what they don't have. They have this terrible sense that their life doesn't matter. When I lived in a home for people with AIDS, very striking to see the brokenness of individuals who were suffering from this terrible disease. And it requires a response. a personal response, which could be one of indifference or it could be one of warmth, but also a societal one. And in a democracy, this is perfect to discuss in a law school. What does the government ask of its citizens when it comes to the questions of the common good, particularly of the poor, particularly of the weak, and the individuals who live at the mercy of others? As you explore very important questions in the law, such as the question of the right to die, which will dominate this century, you watch. The baby boomers have screwed up everything, and they're going to screw up death, in my view. Because I really fear that the right to die, and you hear this discussion now, but the right to die is a right the poor are going to get. Mark my words on this. Because you can draw up scenarios about the right to die, but when you look at its application for individuals who have no one that even cares that they exist. I ran Florida's Health and Human Services Agency. We had 40,000 employees dealing with the disabled and the mentally ill and foster children and people on food stamps, and go through all of life's miseries, the very issues I'm discussing about the person of the poor. And we were in charge with very difficult responsibilities, and I looked at some very brave men and women that worked there for very little pay with overwhelming caseloads, and I suspect it's true in North Carolina or any state you come from, that you see very, very much the same thing. Individuals who are doing this work feeling that they don't have the resources they need, but they also feel like they're battling in the face of a very steady headwind because of the broken families and the situations that they encounter. So what's society's response to all these things? And I think this is where faith and politics converge. I want to just try to make 3 brief points. I don't want to talk a long time because working in politics, I definitely grew tired of hearing long speeches. So you probably are the same way, but I do want to leave a lot of time for question and answer. So I will do that. But I'm going to try to touch upon a few points. I think that when you start talking about faith and politics, which is my topic today, and in this speaker series on practical politics and the law, faith, politics, and the law being my topic, I think we first have to talk a little bit, if you're talking about American law, about this question of church and state. And what role is there within our democracy, within our government, for people of faith, or for the voice of faith, or for the role of church? How does church and state intersect? When I started running President Bush's FaithBased Initiative, you heard a lot of criticisms that the FaithBased Initiative, and I'd be happy to answer questions about it, but you heard a lot of criticisms that it was going to institute a theocracy, that church and state were going to become one, or that it was going to become a payback to the religious right, or that it was going to be an effort to Christianize government. These were the persistent criticisms that existed at the outset of the initiative, but when you look back 6 years later, there's very, very little evidence that that took place at all. I think when you look at the case law that exists, there's been a body of law pushing toward neutrality on matters of church and state, that the state doesn't favor a religion, doesn't fund a religion, doesn't support inherently religious activities. But we also can dangerously drift in a direction that takes a very secularist view of the Constitution, and what some in the 1940s would talk about the high wall, the high and impregnable wall of separation between church and state. When you look at a reading of the founding citizens of our country in their work about where does church and state intersect, it's very interesting to read of how these were very devout religious individuals, perhaps from different religious faiths and backgrounds or takes on the deity, but very devout. George Washington, I'm going to just take a couple examples, and I would commit to your study work by Dr. James Hudson at the Library of Congress, who's written extensively on that. That's Hutson, and also a work by Philip Hamburger on separation of church and state. But at his inauguration, George Washington, in our infancy, added to his own oath, "So help me God," and actually bent over and kissed the Bible at his inauguration. It's worth reading his farewell address. In 1787, you had 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, who wasn't a minister. He stood up and implored the fellow delegates to pray daily for the help of God in designing the Constitution. And he spoke of how at the Continental Congress, they met in the same room where they had previously prayed for this divine assistance and how their prayers were heard. This was Franklin's take. And he said, "Have we forgotten that powerful friend, that if a sparrow can fall to the ground without his notice, is it possible that an empire cannot rise without his aid?" Thomas Jefferson is the father in many ways of so many of our foundational documents. And he was the person who coined that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. It was in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association in January of 1802, where he wrote that phrase. He had originally, interestingly enough, he had originally written the phrase, a wall of eternal separation. And he struck through eternal, research has shown. But 2 days after, my point on this, on Jefferson, is 2 days after he wrote this letter, where he used that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, he was attending church services in a government building. Can you imagine that today if we were having church services in the government building? But here is an individual who's usually cited as the wall of separation between church and state, attending church services in a government building, and in fact had an executive branch personnel, the Marine Band, playing the hymns. And in our Supreme Court, from 1801 to 1809, we had church services in the Supreme Court building itself. Common in the first 50 years of our country, state taxpayers supported ministries and the building of churches. Unthinkable today. But in fact, that's true in the first 50 years. And Massachusetts was the last state to end that practice in 1833. Some states, I live in Pennsylvania now, in some states you were required to take an oath of belief in heaven and hell. And in Delaware, you had to profess a belief in the resurrection. You can go on through history, through Lincoln's references. Many will talk about President Bush's references to faith and to God, and many will criticize it. You could look at Franklin Roosevelt, where he talked about the mercy of the cross during a time of war. It was in his speech to Congress. And President Carter, in a private ride with the president of South Korea, who was a Buddhist, tried to convert him to Christianity in the limo. You imagine President Bush did that, Karzai of Afghanistan. Quite an uproar. All this is to say, let's hold a similar standard throughout presidential politics, throughout presidencies, to have a standard that's equally applied to all, because the fact is, throughout time, there have been American presidents speaking about faith from the presidential pulpit and have tried to apply their own personal faith often to the questions of governance. I think it's worth starting from that point when you talk about faith and politics. And second, I think faith and politics and the law converge on values. I think that goes without saying. You know this from your studies, because the laws that are passed have inherent values expressed, or they may express them or they may be based upon them, but they are in one way or another promoting values. This speaker series addresses your possible involvement in politics. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. For a country like ours to truly be living up to its high ideals, and of course we fall short of them. We know this. You see the injustice in our society. We know that we don't live up to our ideals. But for that, if it's ever going to take place, it requires individuals like you to choose to get involved in the affairs of state and governance. Choose to be involved in the questions of the day, and also to be involved in this debate about values. When you look around, you see a struggle in our culture over these values. When I go to the ocean with my kids, when I first took them there, we'd stand on the shore there, and I'd point out in the water, and I'd say, do you see those kids out there playing in there? There'd be a raft or something. And within a minute, you would see the kids were now over here, because the current had moved them. The kids weren't aware of this movement. They're playing in the water. But in fact, there was a very strong current that had pulled them over there. And my point, of course, is to tell the kids, I want them to play in front of me. They have to resist the current, play in front of me, and if you're going to drown your brother, do it close enough so I can get there at the very last second. So those are kind of the instructions there in the ocean. But I think we have to look at the currents that are running today that shape values about the person of the poor in particular. We have 2.3 million youth using drugs today. I would often at the White House go to faith-based programs, successful faith-based programs all over the country, many community-based programs. See some wonderful work being done by the Boys and Girls Club and the Y and others. I remember going to the Dream Center in St. Louis and meeting Lonell, who was 12 when he entered there at that program. It was an after-school program. At age 12, he didn't even know his alphabet. His parents were drug users. His mother was very much engaged in the criminal justice system. His brothers and sisters were crack babies. And there was another boy, but that child, by the way, ended up reading up to the 4th grade level in a year through an intervention there. And then a guy named Sammy who was 14, I remember he was already flirting with trouble at 14. And when you look at gang and gang involvement, it's often kids dying of that loneliness. They're looking for somewhere to be beloved, to be welcomed, to fit in, to find a home, a family, even a perverse family, even a destructive family situation like a gang is. And Sammy started smoking pot when he was 8. And when we look at so many children today that grow up in broken families, and then we look at a very highly sexualized culture, highly violent culture. These are values that are being brought to bear on the affairs of state, and the real losers are the poor when human beings are degraded. When you see how women are treated in public media and how they are treated as objects, and of course this leads to a cycle of violence against them and a kind of a diminishment of their God-given dignity when they're treated as mere objects, sex objects. And you see this also now, a trend in the culture, values that are now blurring the line between children and adults. Because in a culture that puts the interests of adults ahead of children, the real losers, of course, are going to be the little and powerless and weak. Not just children, but the poor. But the children too suffer. I was watching I didn't watch them, but I was in the run-up to the Oscars, some of the movies that are out there now, each one getting a little more bold, Notes on a Scandal. It was the woman nominated for that Oscar. She was a high school teacher that began a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old student. And in the movie Big, it was interesting, 20 years ago, if you saw Tom Hanks in Big, it kind of his breakout movie, that was a story of a 12-year-old who wanted to be big and then went to Voltaire and made a wish at a carnival, and then Voltaire turned him into Tom Hanks. It's like, I've gone to that machine, it's never worked. I'm still short and bald. But so now he's a 30-year-old, but he's a 12-year-old inside. And then, of course, he gets a job in New York. He moves in with a woman at work, and then he lives with her, has relations, has sleepovers. And but then when she found out that he was 12, when he confided his secret, there was a touching scene where she then kissed him on his forehead because he was a child. But you see now, 20 years later, it's different. There, the character is having relations with him because he's a child. On NPR this morning, as I was driving to Pittsburgh Airport, I don't know if you heard the story of a movie out that tells the story of a 12-year-old that's administering heroin to her mother and father, measuring the dose of heroin for the mother and father. So these blurring of lines. Why do I bring it up? To sound like church lady moralizing about the decline in values in Hollywood? No. But when human beings and their dignity are degraded, the ones that really suffer are the poor, who crave respect and welcome and often don't find it. And the reality is, if you look in a country that has broken marriages and families, it's very hard for those who are at the mercy of society to thrive and follow the dreams that you're able to follow. And the last point I want to make, in addition to the points on the values that are inherent in this debate, And you may have different values than mine, but that's really what's at stake when religion and faith and politics converge. The last point I want to talk about are for individuals who may be here wondering whether you want to work in politics, whether that's someplace you want to go into that crucible of public opinion. Senator Mark Hatfield, a man I worked for years, a Republican senator from Oregon, he defined politics as an exercise in human relations. And I've always believed that was an accurate definition of what politics is. I am now in academia. When I was leaving the White House, a person came up to me and they said, you think you're leaving politics by leaving the White House. But I'll tell you, in academia, the politics are especially vicious because the stakes are so small. And no criticism of my colleagues in it. The jury's still out on it, and I have to say, I am delighting in my experiences at Saint Vincent with the students there. We have 1,700 students there. Rejoicing in it, actually. But if you define politics as the exercise in human relations, then you're going to be involved in politics. In your hospital, if you're going to be a physician, there are hospital politics. If you're going to be involved in business, you will run into it in the marketplace, the politics of the marketplace, because of these human interactions. And certainly in government, you see politics expressed as we debate policies and priorities. Mother Teresa was asked one time at the end of her life. And it's a story that I tell because it's a telling story for anyone. It's a cautionary tale as well for anyone entering a life in politics or public service. She was asked at the end of her life didn't she get discouraged because she'd been working in Calcutta for 50 years, and for every person she was picking up there on the street, there were still 10 people dying all alone. And that after 50 years, nothing really had changed. And the reporter said, don't you get discouraged? And she said, no. She said, God doesn't call me to be successful. God calls me to be faithful. And I say that because there's a temptation when someone wants to get into political life and maybe seek public office to immediately feel like, well, I'm going to have to make compromises along the way in my values, in my own personal morality, and how I view the world. It's words in Scripture about render to Caesar the things that are Caesar and to God the things that are God's. I think that's what I've tried to do in my own work, is to remember the words Thomas More said when he was a great figure in 16th century England, working with King Henry VIII. He said, I'm the king's good servant, but God's first. How does a person of faith work in a political environment? That they're the king's good servant, but God's first. That you don't compromise your values. Jesus said something in Scriptures which was very, I pondered all the time. He said, say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no, and anything else is from the evil one. And in politics, of course, the art is to never say yes or no to anything, right? It's you see people on an interview and they go, do you support this or not? Well, I think that, and off they go, yes or no. But you don't hear it. So there's a danger there. It doesn't mean that the people that don't give yes or no answer, because you also have to be wise. There's another Scripture passage about being wise as a snake and innocent as a dove. Don't get those confused. So to try to also be, to use prudence and to use your judgment, but also to recognize you may fail. Well, my friends that are going into public life and running for office, they have to be willing to lose. They have to be willing to not get reelected, which is the hardest lesson. It's easy to lose. It's very hard to lose when you're up for reelection, because there you want to stay in. You've built up a base. You've built up some experience. And you want to take the lessons that you've learned and continue to apply them with the high ideals that brought you into public life in the first place. So there's a real pressure to get reelected. But you have to be willing to lose in that reelection and to be rejected by voters and to be told you are not our representative anymore. I think that's an important lesson for individuals that are looking at public life and a possible life of service there. I don't think that your values have to be compromised. I think you have to be able to clearly set your own priorities if you're going to work in public life. And you have to be willing to walk from a job if you feel that you're in good conscience you cannot continue. So I'd be happy now with those 3 points I wanted to make about religion or faith and politics and the law. I'd be very happy now to throw it open for questions. And I promised my friend Jessie Dreyfus, who's here with me, she's a freshman here at Duke, that I would not embarrass her, so I'm not going to call on Jessie right here in the front row. She's an undergraduate here at Duke, and a real gift. You all know how lucky you are that she's here. So now, having embarrassed her, I'd be very happy to answer questions. Yes?
A lot of people hold a view that that faith, specifically mainstream American Christianity, has been hijacked by people like Karl Rove or James Dobson for political purposes. So for someone like Jim Wallis, who in his book talks about the 2,000 direct references to poverty, a very clear scriptural calling to action, he sees a problem when the 2004 election, in his opinion, was exploited or people were misguided by passions about homosexuality and their opinions on homosexuality, where he says that there are just 2 indirect references in the Bible. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Wow. Well, on the issue of politics being hijacking religion for its purposes, kind of for worldly ends, maybe to win an election or to discredit an opponent, I think that in Washington, the guy selling hot dogs on the corner is political. The reality is people are going to use religion. The question is whether it's a legitimate use of religion or not. My feeling is you're not going to banish faith from the public square, but people have their own agendas, and they're going to try to further their agenda in Washington, and they may try to drape them in Scripture. And even when you talk about the poor, I think Jim Wallis is a friend of mine. He and I agree that there is a biblical mandate about attention to the needs of the poor. You would literally have to ignore passages throughout the Old and New Testament if you were to take the position otherwise. The question is, how do you effectively address the needs of the poor? Is it through a government program? Do you measure compassion by how big the block grant is? Do we talk about effective interventions instead, which is where I come from? I've seen effective government programs. I don't have a big problem with paying taxes. I'm not into the let's cut taxes movement. I don't have a problem with paying taxes. To me, it's a cover charge for living in America. And if I make more money, I pay more taxes, and I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem with throwing money at problems with failed approaches and with the hypocrisy that comes of speaking of the poor without looking at whether the programs we put in their service work or not. When I came back to Washington after being out of it for 20 years, and I went back to the soup kitchen I worked in every Saturday for 3 years, and I went in that neighborhood, the schools there in Anacostia were as pitiful and miserable as they had been 20 years ago, and this with some of the highest per pupil expenditures in the country. Because part of the problem was we were throwing money at it, but the root causes were largely spiritual. Broken families, unloved kids that didn't want to choose well, had no real role models in their life, had no opportunity to escape. There was no one there to help them out. Drug treatment programs. We'll throw someone in county rehab 6, 7 times. Never once asked, did they recover? Because so often, if you don't listen to why the person's putting the needle in their arm, you're never going to help them recover. You can throw all the services at them you want. So many of the problems of our poor are spiritual in nature, but a lot of the great advocates for greater spending in government programs never ask whether they work. Now that can become a cop-out the other way, which is individuals say, well, gee, since they don't work, let's put all the money over here toward this, program. Forget about the poor since the programs don't work. That's a cop-out. We have a responsibility to be attentive to the needs of our poor around us and to look for effective programs, and we should fund effective programs. But let's take one. This is a long answer, but let's go to Head Start, for example. Head Start is viewed as one of the is a very successful early childhood intervention program. It's a multi-billion-dollar program, $6 or $7 billion. It's written as if it's a competitive program on the statutes, but you know what? It's not at all. It's completely rigged. Once you get a Head Start grant, you will keep it unless either you close your chapter or go out of business, or both. But you keep it forever, whether you're effectively interacting with these kids or not, whether there's a better one up the street or not, doesn't matter. You have it forever. And those Head Start lobbies are very powerful. So what they do is they go and talk about the poor in Congress. But they never talk about how the poor are doing in the programs. See, to me, that's as hypocritical as someone citing Scripture in a way that would absolve government from doing anything about the poor. I think both sides have to do a lot of soul searching about looking at effective interventions in the lives of the poor. Did that answer your question? Great. Yes?
I'm Professor Choi from Korea. Currently, I'm teaching in comparative jurisprudence. In my course, also this topic, law, politics, and religion is very important and crucial. I know that in American law school, this topic is taught mainly or only in constitutional law. As you know, in Europe, for example, in Germany, there is independent course, church law and church and state. How do you see the situation of university education on this topic? Do you have any observation or your thought, or what is the desirable direction with the curriculum, at least in terms of the law schools?
Well, I don't know a lot about them, truthfully. I know that the topic is very important. What you'll find is there is a body of law dealing with church-state law. In fact, the Supreme Court has taken up a lawsuit that I was named in called the Freedom from Religion Foundation versus Towey. They changed it to my successor, Jay Hine. But it's litigation involving the question of whether the White House conferences we were holding was in some way government subsidy of religion. And so the court, although there's a separate issue, that's how the lawsuit was filed, but the court is probably going to look more on a taxpayer standing issue. That's how it will be resolved, and I think that the Freedom from Religion Foundation will lose. But what you'll find, though, on some of these church-state questions is they play out in an indirect way. They play out in family court, on marriage and family law cases. They play out in juvenile court, on the questions of how do we hold our youth responsible. Mark my words, we will have elderly courts for the same reason we have juvenile courts, diminished capacity. When the 82-year-old drives into the market and clips someone, or someone with mild dementia goes and shoplifts. You know, as we age, America's aging. By 2010, get ready for the baby boom, you know. And we're all in denial about that, of course. Mick Jagger looks great, you know, until he falls down on stage and breaks his hip, you know, has to get a hip replacement. He'll still, you know, we'll all pretend we're in our 20s with our lighters. So you find a lot of these questions where church and state interact playing out indirectly in the lives of Americans and in the values that are underlying judicial determinations about what value life. So I don't see that the courts will ever have a separate court system for the cases, but there is a separate body of law for it. I'd love to see more programs like you have here at this university and at this law school trying to raise awareness on these subjects, because these cultural currents aren't going away. And I see our young people who often get caught in the undertow of it. 13 and 14-year-old kids having sex. I was in the health clinics there in Jacksonville seeing kids getting treated for syphilis that are, 13-year-old kid. And I've spent a lot of my life around hookers. Let me explain. But you go to drug treatment programs and you see individuals, great God-given dignity, that became enslaved to crack, and you listen to them talk about their journey, their downward spiral. And the to listen to their stories and what led them into, what was the wound in their life that often led them to use the drug that led them into the prostitution. Just a downward spiral. I learned so much from the men and women that had AIDS in the Gift of Peace home. And to be with them as they were dying, but to hear them as they tried to sort through their lives, make peace with their lives. You know, these are spiritual questions that government is powerless to address. It requires people like you and me to be involved. But government cannot love. And this was the premise of President Bush's faith-based initiative. It's just a fact it can't. You can have some loving people working in government, but you go look at the systems. Government can't love. Government can't develop relationship. The food stamp worker can't befriend the poor. So this is church-state law playing out in America, because the issue has to do with the value of that individual's life, the sanctity of that individual's life. Are they just throwaway people? Is that all our culture is going to do? Push to the margins our disabled, stick them in cluster homes, exile our elderly into institutions, put nice pastel wall coloring on the walls, but in reality those are death row. They're waiting for their death to come. No one's visiting them. Is this what our culture is going to, are these the values that we are going to embrace? Or these are our politics? So these are the questions that are confronting us and are confronting our courts. But unfortunately, when our courts get to it, it's often too late. And the determinations are meaningless in the lives of the poor. So, yes, sir.
A lot of strict separationists are not really concerned as much about how religion might affect government. They're more concerned about how government might affect religion. Can you speak to specifically the President's faith-based initiatives program and how it takes steps, or if it takes steps, to both comply with Constitution requirements and not negatively impact sectarian religious enterprises?
Yeah, we early on tried to communicate. One of the first things I did when I got the job was to put up the do's and don'ts of working with the federal government, so that groups came in with their eyes wide open. So to tell them you can't preach on Uncle Sam's dollar, you can't proselytize, you can't discriminate in terms of whom you serve. You can't say, if you come and worship this morning, then you can come into our federally funded job training program. Can't do that. That you can't say we only serve Christians here, we only serve Jews here, if you're taking public money. And that you welcome people of all faiths through the doors. So there are certain, those are all driven by court interpretations of the First Amendment and what are in funding of inherently religious activities, state neutrality, and those concepts. Lemon case. But the flip side of it was that we also weren't going to require organizations to secularize if they wanted to play ball with government. And by that I mean, here was the landscape when President Bush took office in 2001. You had groups that were told that the mezuzah at the door had to come down and the cross had to come off the wall. You had to change your name. You had to have a diverse board of directors. They couldn't be of all one faith. You couldn't have a mission statement for your organization that spoke of Jesus Christ or the Torah. These were the actual regulations that were in place. There was no basis in constitutional law for this. But that's what government had done through what I believe was a misreading of the First Amendment and the cases, the high impregnable wall cases that are hotly contested. So you're trying to find the balance where you don't want church and state to become one. We've seen in the world how disastrous that is with the Taliban and with other demonstrations of when church and state become one, and that coercion, which is antithetical to faith. When you coerce people to recite certain words. And you can risk that at a certain homeless shelter. Force them to say, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, or you can't sleep here at night. That's repugnant to true religion and to true faith. But government often, the Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty was told by the Department of Health and Human Services, you can't apply for this program, you have Jewish in your name. Now, I never understood it, You could go into these federally funded programs, they could have Britney Spears posters up there, and but if there was a cross up, that's offensive. That has to come down. It just seems bizarre that the First Amendment could be read in a way that would communicate that to a group. So you've got to, of course, you're going to have delicacies. You've got to look at the totality of the environment, how coercive the environment is. So there's I personally said, look, the poor should have access to the most effective programs. Many of them are faith-based. If we force some of these groups to secularize, they are robbed of the very vitality of their program because it was the spiritual impetus of the employees and the volunteers that led to its effectiveness in the first place. So you don't want to do that, but why not give them access to those programs, put in safeguards, and then you're going to run the risk that every once in a while a grantee is going to get the money and go buy choir robes with it. Or they're going to go out there and right in the middle of the job training program or the welfare to work program, they're going to start talking about Jesus. If they do that, they need to have their grant pulled. If the ACLU had called me and said, here's a grantee that's doing such and such that was proselytizing, they didn't have to sue me. We would have pulled the grant. So we tried to communicate those, and I think by and large, look at the track record after 6 years and billions of dollars in grants to faith-based groups.
First of all, thank you for coming. I was hoping I could attach my question to your answer to that last question, having to do with the name, Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Because it is my understanding that in order to receive government grant money, you do have to have a secular program that you're offering to the public. It can't be based in faith, necessarily. So is it inherently political, giving the office the name Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, if it's almost a misnomer in that sense?
Well, the office is actually the Office of Faith-Based and Community. Yeah, but you raise a metaphysical point. There you go again. Because is Mother Teresa's smile, is that preaching? I mean, she's clearly motivated by a very strong faith, love of Jesus Christ. Is she preaching when she smiles at you, when she loves you? Because it's clearly the outgrowth of her own religious fervor. Because your question points out accurately that a program has to be a non-sectarian program, a secular program. But faith-filled people in a faith-based organization can administer that program. So let's take job training, for example, or a drug treatment program. They can have a secular program that talks about addiction and it talks about all the 12-step program. You talk to people in addiction, there isn't a whole lot of successful programs out there that aren't built around the 12 steps. However, those are applied different ways by different groups. Some speak of a higher power. I went to Beit Tshuva in Pasadena, California, a Jewish program built around the Torah, wildly successful. Rabbi Borovitz there, wildly successful dealing with recovery for addicts and helping them reconnect to their Jewish roots. So these are very faith-filled people that were administering a secular program. Is that a violation of the Constitution? The court's never gotten into what's motivating an individual to work, what makes them go out, what unites the group. But what we have looked at, which is called charitable choice, which looked at the right of organizations to hire on a religious basis. Charitable choice was first enacted on the Welfare to Work law in 1996. Then it was put on the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Act. Then it was put on the Community Services Block Grant Act. And it stood for this proposition. It said you have Title VII civil rights that allow you to hire on a religious basis. That's been true since the 60s. Upheld in the 72 Amos case, unanimously by the Supreme Court, that said you could hire on a religious basis. That was not a violation of the Constitution. Because think about it, how does an Orthodox Jewish group remain an Orthodox Jewish group if they've got to hire a Jehovah's Witness? It's not going to be they're going to lose the integrity of organization. So they said that's okay. So then the question came, well, what if they take federal money? Can they still hire on a religious basis? Court hasn't resolved that question, hasn't even been presented with it. I'm sure they will. But Congress passed some laws that said you can hire on a religious basis and take federal money, and those were the 3 laws I cited. President Clinton, by the way, signed the first charitable choice law. But when President Bush proposed the exact same thing, the right-wing religious nut jobs are trying to commandeer government services. But he was simply proposing what President Clinton proposed. So now maybe President Clinton didn't want to do it, but had to do it as part of political compromise. You can get into all the who, what, when, where, why, but the fact is that's when it was first enacted. So that's a question that hasn't been resolved by the courts. But from my own standpoint, Planned Parenthood takes hundreds of millions of federal dollars a year. They hire according to their ideals and mission and values. You can bet on it. If you are, a devout Catholic, very orthodox on those issues and on right to life issues, you're not going to get hired by Planned Parenthood. I'm just telling you. There's an invisible sign out front that says, do not apply here. So they discriminate in their hiring. You can bet on it. And you know what? I respect their right to do that. Because how can they be who they are if they don't reflect their mission through their hiring decisions? But why have the double standard and single out the faith-based group and say, but you are discriminating when you hire according to your ideals and principles? Yeah.
I think that the office that you were director of has a potential to be one of the greatest legacies that the president has, domestic legacies, but that's if certain things don't happen. And one of the things that I would worry so much about is exclusionary tactics and raising up institutions within civil society that separate out people, that get the Jewish kid or the Muslim kid his ass kicked because he didn't go to the Jesus program that was sponsored by the government. That when you're sitting there and you choose not to be a part of something that's sponsored by the government, that's sponsored by something that we're all supposed to be a part of, you are excluded from the system. And that's one of the things. It's not a secular thing. I think spirituality is a great thing, and I think it's always been there. And you cited many instances where it's been there. But when it comes to the establishment, when it comes to making things greater within civil society, you get worried.
You do. I think you're absolutely right. There are dangers everywhere around it in the faith-based community initiative of President Bush. But it's worth it. It's worth the endeavor. It's worth the risk because the poor deserve access to effective programs. If you were poor, and if you were living in a neighborhood in Cleveland and you saw the schools year in and year out turn out horrible students, imagine, I approach this now as a parent, not as a former White House guy, but just as a parent, the injustice of that I'm obliged to send my kids to a failing school, to a bureaucracy that really is not enriching the lives of the kids and has such a proven so why do we fund it? Because the debate quickly becomes if you cut the funding or if you give vouchers and let someone choose on where they want to send someone, you are undermining the social fabric, you're fraying the social safety net and destroying government institutions. Now, there are probably people out there in America that want to destroy government institutions. I have never believed the tenet that we should just get rid of all government programs because then people would lift up their fallen brother or sister, but now they expect government to do that. The people that say that are never there up on the tightrope when the net's getting changed, the ones that say that, because that's one heck of a gamble. They're never the ones whose butt is on the line. They're always the ones saying, we ought to try that experiment. Oops, sorry. The reality is I think government does have a responsibility. The question is how do we discharge that responsibility? And unfortunately, the debate is often teetered between polarizing voices, one that just measures compassion by how big the block grant is. If you're not a big spender for big taxes, for big programs, you're a heartless, uncaring cad. And on the other side are the groups that are saying, like we need rugged individualism and private beneficence. And the reality is many of the wealthy give a large amount of money to programs that would give more if government weren't siphoning it off. And they prove that point by saying, what would you like to do with $20 to help the poor? Give it to government or give it to that United Way program over across town? Of course you'd give it to this program or to your church or synagogue or mosque. So I think that's why between those two poles and that ugly debate, we've got to develop a greater sensitivity about the poor. And I close my remarks by simply saying, I hope while you're here, you're at a great age in your life. And I hope while you're here, you find a way to befriend the poor and encounter them and to meet them and go outside of your comfort zone, because if you do that, you will discover the great gift they have to give to you and your need for them. And you will then, I think, go wherever you go with your law degree, you will go with a new sense of what justice consists of and a real burning desire to try to reach out to them. And I don't know whether you will succeed or not, but I believe that you can be faithful in doing that. Whenever I see Sarah stand up there at the White House, that was the sign that said, it is time to wrap up and let you all go. I want to thank you for the very warm welcome. I again apologize, Jesse, for embarrassing you. here. I really want to apologize for that. And you were nice to take an hour out to come to this program. God bless you. Thanks.